Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry for this delay, but we're glad to start the session. Thank you very much for coming to join us this morning. My name is Shotaro Yachi. I'll be moderating the session. We have today Michael Green and James Dunward from the US side and Yoshihiko Noda from the Japanese side. None of these three people needs extended introduction. You have in your file their CVs for further details. But I do want to begin by thanking the Sasaka Peace Foundation and its most dedicated people for supporting the week-long event. Also, as always, my thanks are due to the members of the USJI and their able staffers who have worked hard to lay the groundwork for the important event that's begun. Now it is that back to school time of the year. But in Japan, as well as in the United States, it is back to election time. And that means one thing, prolonged chaos. Political leaders are obsessed with a single issue of how best to win their elections, so much so that they care far less than necessary about anything long-term, let alone anything like alliance management. That is what is like in Japan, and the situation is no different here, I suppose. To make the matter even worse, Japan is going to have not just one, but a multiple number of elections this month. Both the ruling Democratic Party of Japan, DPJ, and the opposition party, Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, LDP, will have their leadership elections. Who are going to be the winners will determine the situation that will ensure. As for the LDP leadership contest, set to take place on the 26th of this month, it looks like it will be a very much heated one, probably with 6 candidates running. A widely held view holds that after the party leadership elections, there will be the general elections for the lower house, House of Representatives. Strangely though, no one can tell as of yet what the central agenda for the election would be. Could it be about the TPP, undoing the consumption tax law, or could it be on what to do with nuclear energy? I frankly cannot tell you what. In addition, the next year, 2013, is the election year for the upper house, the House of Councillors. I think the majority of the Japanese voters are eager to see their politics stabilized with a strong leader who could stay in office much longer than the ones who have come and gone. Only then, a lot of people in Japan also know could the Japanese leaders sit down with the Americans, think big and long in order for both countries to shape the future course of the Indo-Pacific Asia region. So we are all in a great transition period, or a great intermission, if you like a dramatized expression. But for us here in this room this morning, it means that we are in a very opportune time, no less so than usual, to make our thoughts and ideas known to the leaders, or the leaders in making, of both nations, who should seek something new, something strategic, something long range. On that point, I'm pleased to say that we are fortunate to have Jim and Mike After the session, I am sure that they will use their distinguished networks to spread over voices, DC-wide and beyond. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let us just hear what the first speaker has to say. Mr. Zuki, please.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction, and I also want to thank USJI for staging this wonderful event. It's great to see so many people who are interested in US-Japan relations coming to this event, because I think these kinds of discussions go a long way toward helping us very much in formulating the right approaches. I wanted to thank Ambassador Yachi, but I did want to mention there was only one thing he said that I might disagree with, and that is that he introduced Mike and I on the American side and Taniguchi-sensei on the Japanese side. But actually, I think we're on the same side, because we face some common challenges in the region, but we share common values and common interests. So I'd like to think that we're all on the same side in addressing some of the challenges we face today. And it's because of this feature of our relationship between the United States and Japan, the fact that we share common values and we have many common interests, that from the perspective of the United States, our alliance and our relationship with Japan really is the cornerstone of our strategic engagement in Asia. Virtually every challenge that we face, we look to Japan to be a part of the solution in helping us address that challenge. So for that reason, I think when we think of US-Japan alliance in the United States government, we're not only talking about our bilateral relationship, but rather our foreign policy and how Japan is our partner in so many areas of the world and helping us address some of these things that we're facing. As you know, on this administration, we've talked about re-engagement strategy in Asia, and one of those pillars has been strengthening alliances, and certainly I think we have done a good job working together with Japan in strengthening and bringing forward our already very strong relationship. This was reflected, I think, in the joint statement that the White House issued on the occasion of Prime Minister Noda's visit to Washington this spring, and our efforts to promote rule of law, protect human rights, enhance coordination on peacekeeping, post-conflict stabilization, development assistance, infectious diseases. There are so many areas and so many challenges where we're working together. My guess is many of you did not read that document, and I think one reason is it's so long and so comprehensive. But to me, it really was impressive to see how broad our engagement with Japan is. And we also have a lot of new areas where we want to work together in areas like promoting freedom of navigation on the high seas, space and cyberspace. And what we're looking for is sort of that users of those domains use them responsibly and that there be a rules-based system to ensure access for all. And when we talk to Japan about that, we very much have sort of common approaches toward these issues. And so that's one reason why our partnership, I'm confident, will endure. Another important facet, though, of our relationship is the deep friendship between Japanese and American peoples. I was in Japan working at the U.S. Embassy during the earthquake. In fact, I was at the Foreign Ministry talking to some Foreign Ministry officials when the earthquake occurred. And I think the aftermath of that tremendous tragedy in Japan really brought home for me the extent of the friendship between Japanese and American peoples. About 4 months later, I was on vacation visiting my father's hometown, which is a small town of about 25,000 people in the Central Valley of California. It's pretty far from the ocean, not a lot of foreigners. It's a farming community with a lot of small businesses. And when I went to the drugstore to purchase something, at the cash register there was a little gift box for helping Japanese tsunami victims, and it was full of coins that people had put in, even in this small town. So even in places like that, where you wouldn't think of it being at the forefront of US-Japan friendship, there were a lot of people there who felt empathy for Japanese victims and wanted in their own small way to contribute. And I think that was just one example of the depth of the personal relationships that provide some ballast and support for the work that we're doing in the political and security spheres, but also, of course, economic and other issues as well. So that was the second point I wanted to make, was in addition to our sort of broad political partnership, we do have very broad economic relations. Many Japanese companies have invested in the United States, employ a lot of Americans. I worked for 3 years for Ambassador Howard Baker from Tennessee, and he was very fond of saying that the largest private sector employer in his hometown of Huntsville, Tennessee, was a Japanese company. So he was very aware of the benefits that Japanese who invest in the United States, their contributions to the American economy. So that's a second area where I think we are working together very well. And then the third area where I think it's very important for us to think about is the people-to-people ties and exchanges. I mentioned how there really is a depth of support in the United States for Japan, but a lot of that is because of the personal ties that people have forged over time. I hate to mention my father's small town too much, but this small town in Central California, about 15 miles from there, there's a very nice Japanese art museum. You wouldn't think about that. It's in a town called Hanford, California. Again, a pretty small town of maybe 50,000 people. And the reason that that place exists is because of one individual, Bill Clark, who was in the Air Force and stationed in Japan as a young man and became very interested in Edo period art. And he is a farmer and made a lot of money and started collecting art, and now has opened his collection up. He actually has a curator, and there's a very nice Japanese cultural center. He has a building that looks like kind of like a Buddhist temple in this small American town. But the reason that tie exists, and every year there's I think about 50 or 60,000 visitors coming, and a lot of them are school children learning about Japanese culture. But the reason that tie exists is because of the personal connection that he had, where he was stationed in Japan, fell in love with the country, and maintained his own personal connection. So I really see these ties of young people visiting each other's countries, these kind of visits and connections as investments in our future. Because the young people today from Japan who are coming to the United States, or the young Americans who go to Japan, are the people in 10, 20, and 30 years who are going to be making decisions in the fields they have and continuing to promote and support U.S.-Japan relations. So we very much would like to see a continuity, but also an increase in the number of students going back and forth. And there I think I have some good news and some challenges that we face. On the good news side, the number of Americans going to Japan and studying is actually increasing. We see that in the State Department, where the number of people coming into the State Department who have Japanese language skills has actually increased quite a bit over the last decade, certainly compared to when I came into the State Department, when that was very unusual. So that's a very positive thing. The base, though, the number of Americans who are in Japan is still rather low. We'd like to see more people going. And certainly the efforts of places like Waseda University, for example, who host a lot of foreign students, is very, very important in this effort. On the other side, the number of Japanese students who are coming this way, unfortunately, has declined, and we'd like to address that. I think this year, for the first time in many years, the number of people coming into the U.S. Embassy and our U.S. consulates applying for student visas has increased slightly, so that's good news, but we need to work hard to increase that. I think there's a variety of reasons, some of which are economic, I think, but we need to, on both sides, I think, work hard to continue promoting these exchanges of young people, and so that's something that I think is homework for all of us. And I think all of you in the audience know people. If you're Japanese, you probably know Americans who've gone to Japan, and vice versa. So I think that's something all of us need to work on very much together. And then lastly, of course, I'll talk about our security ties and why that's very important. As you know, Japan is the second largest host of American military, and soon will be the country where we have more American military than any other as we draw down in Afghanistan. About 50,000 American military stationed in Japan or around Japan. And with dependents, it brings it to over 100,000. Japan is a very wonderful host for U.S. Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Army, and we very much appreciate Japan's contributions to our alliance. In addition to furnishing facilities for Americans to live, work, and train, it's a wonderful relationship that we have. Japan also pays quite a bit of the cost of stationing American military abroad. Probably many of you know this, but we have 23,000 Japanese employees working on American military facilities, and their salaries, almost all, are paid for by the Japanese government. About 70% of the utilities costs of U.S. military facilities in Japan are borne by the Japanese taxpayer. and also much of the cost of training relocation, where we're moving forces off of some areas where they're rather densely concentrated, the Kanto Plain and Okinawa, to other places to train. Much of that cost is also borne by the Japanese government. So it's a wonderful partnership. But even more than that, of course, is the Japanese Self-Defense Forces as a partner for the United States. A very wonderful relationship we have, Navy to Navy, Air Force to Air Force, and so forth, where we do a lot of joint training. And certainly as allies, we're much stronger and much able to work together. So I think from the perspective of the United States, it's a very strong and vibrant partnership, very strong and vibrant security relationship. It doesn't mean we don't have work to do. We do, of course. Like any broad-based relationship, there are challenges that we face. But I'm confident that both sides see a lot of common interests and reasons. And I think the main reason why this alliance has endured for so long is fundamentally it's in both countries' interests to maintain that alliance. So I fundamentally remain very positive about U.S.-Japan relations moving forward. Not to say we don't have challenges, because we do. And as I said, I think the main one really is looking very long-term, is continuing to invest in this relationship by encouraging young people on both sides to learn about each other. And so by promoting these kinds of exchange, youth exchanges and other kinds of programs for young Americans and young Japanese, I think we'll continue to have a very vibrant relationship in the future. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to, after all the other presentations, to hearing your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, thank you, and thank you to USJI for hosting this and for your very important presence in Washington and the connection you helped provide with the academic leadership in Japan, and also to Sasakawa for sponsoring this. Yachi-san and Taniguchi-san and Jim, it's a pleasure to be with you. I have to say, Yachi-san is one of the most strategic vice ministers Japan's ever had, and continues to now share that with a new generation of students. And Taniguchi-san is emerging as the kind of Alfred Thayer Mahan of 21st century Japan. And as you'll see in his geography intensive presentations. Jim Zumwalt I first met in 1987, and I have to briefly tell this story. Don't worry, Jim, it's not that story. So Jim, I had just graduated from SAIS. I wouldn't say I knew nothing, because SAIS is a great institution, rusty. But, you know, it was my first real job. And I walked in, and Jim was there in USJR, and I was basically an intern in the Office of Japan Affairs, which, you know, USJR is a very thinly staffed place. So it's basically me and Jim and Glenn Fukushima, who was always in Japan. So in 1987, the summer of 1987, I arrive, and I'm told, you're going to work on trade liberalization of the garbage disposal market in Japan. Because the California Senator, Pete Wilson, was really worked up that the Japanese garbage disposal market was being blocked by non-tariff barriers because, and I'm not making this up, we were being told that Japanese garbage is different. And so I had this case at USJR. Jim was I guess you were a JO, a junior officer at the time in the Foreign Service, transferred from state. And we basically sat in this office, and I don't know if Jim even knows I did this. So I had to come up with a garbage disposal strategy for USTR, and I wrote this letter to the Director General of North American Affairs saying that if we cannot solve this garbage disposal incident, it could have grave consequences for our alliance. And amazingly, it went right through the General Counsel's office, right up to the trade representative, and off it went to Gaikouseisaku, where it was met with mokusatsu. It was completely ignored and there was no response appropriately. It was really fun. It was great. And is Yamazaki Kazu here? I saw his name on the list. So Yamazaki-san was writing for Nikkei Shimbun at the time, and he did a front page story about the crisis in US-Japan relations over trade. And the first episode, the first article in the series, focused on the garbage disposal crisis. That this 24-year-old or 25-year-old guy, who basically, with the benefit of a site's education, was trying to solve. It was really fun, and it was absolutely not in the national interest of the United States or in the national interest of Japan. And so it's worth thinking about that, because Japan-US relations were in the press all the time. We were on the front page of Nikkei Shimbun with these crises. Everybody thought Japan mattered, but it was not for the right reasons all the time. And there was a lot of friction and a lot of drama. And we are in a much, much better place today. When our public opinion polls show deep trust in both countries towards each other, where we are, in my experience, and I assume it's largely the same now, when we go to the G8 or the G20, in my experience in the White House, we were on side with Japan more often than we were on side with anyone, including at times Britain, our historic special partner. So there's not a lot of drama, there's not a lot of sparks. It's hard on Nikkei Shimbun reporters, but we're in a much better place. And I think it's worth remembering that. Recently, I participated with Rich Armitage and Joe Nye, and Randy Schreiber and others in a third version of what's come to be known as the Armitage-Nye reports, a bipartisan effort to try to capture where we are in the relationship and make recommendations going forward. We did one in 2000 and 2007, and we just did one in August. And we argued that Japan really is at a pivotal turning point. And the Japanese public, the Japanese leadership really have to face some important choices and signal whether Japan intends to continue being a major leader in international affairs or choose a less ambitious path. And obviously all of us hoped and encouraged, and everyone in this podium encouraged, the former. And I think Taniguchi-san will talk a little bit more about this sort of pivotal moment Japan is in its strategic history. The US also is at a kind of pivotal moment with our election. And I know from experience in previous transitions that impressions are being formed now, and between November and January, February, March, impressions will start turning into policy, and either a second Obama term or a first Romney term will start charting a strategy for Asia, for the world, and for US-Japan relations based in no small measure on what they see happening now as they're starting to debate and discuss and form policies. So the decisions are important in Japan's history. They're important for, frankly, I think, how the next 4 years of either Romney or Obama administration chart US-Japan relations. And it's, the issue in some ways is not, frankly, what I think or what Jim thinks. The issue is what the senior-most people who become National Security Advisor or Secretary of State think and their impression of Japan. So this is a really important period between now and, say, March. For Japan first and foremost, but for the US to get things right. There's an election. That doesn't always help, but sometimes it can help. Sometimes it can help clarify. Sometimes it can provide a mandate. For those of us in the room who care about the relationship and work on the relationship, it is interesting to write about and talk about the drifting political leadership and the problems in Nagata-cho and here. But frankly, I don't think that's good enough. And really, most of us in this room, I would argue, have an opportunity, if not a responsibility, to start thinking in more detail about the agenda moving forward. It's interesting, you know, you sometimes hear there's Japan passing, there's not enough attention on Japan. If you've been following this, Brookings has just created a new Japan chair. Carnegie has just created a new Japan chair. There's probably more focus on the alliance, appropriately, than there is right now on transatlantic relations, where if you follow the think tank world, there's really a shrinking of focus on Europe. And so with this talent, I think this is a really important time to start charting the agenda and thinking through how to move forward on a range of issues that we'll talk about today. I remember in November 1995, when I was working as an advisor for the Pentagon on what was known then as the NYE Initiative. And the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, was supposed to go to Japan in November and sign a joint declaration with then Prime Minister Murayama, a socialist who took over the government in coalition with the LDP. And the two sides had drafted a joint statement to chart the future of the US-Japan alliance. And a lot of work went into it, and the fruits of which we are still harvesting. Missile defense, intelligence sharing, roles and missions, SACO, you know, we're still working on FTEMA, of course. But the whole agenda, the whole agenda was there. It was being built from the ground up with a lot of work in both governments and think tanks. And it was prepared and served up in a joint statement to Murayama-san. And I remember the draft came back from gaikouseisaku, and Murayama-san had deleted all references to missile defense, defense guidelines, and China. And he had insisted on inserting as the first line, Japan will never fight a war. And I remember people in Foreign Ministry and Defense, then Defense Agency, State, the Embassy, being really deflated. After all that work, frankly, weak political leadership just let everyone down. And this was before President Clinton was supposed to go, I think about 2 weeks before. Suddenly we had a domestic crisis in the US. I think it was the budget crisis. And President Clinton canceled his trip to APEC. He did that twice, by the way, just not to sound partisan, but President Bush went to every APEC meeting. I'm just saying. So President Clinton didn't go, which turned out to be very fortuitous because he rescheduled the trip and he went in April 1996. In the interim, Ryutaro Hashimoto had taken over the government and he was serious about all the agenda issues. Now, the leadership was there and Hashimoto grabbed this, and then I think the Clinton-Hashimoto joint declaration in '96 still is with us in terms of guiding the alliance. It happened because of the leadership of Bill Clinton and Ryutaro Hashimoto, yes, but really the content was built by governments and think tanks on both sides and prepared, and eventually, when the political leadership was right, forward it went. I think we're in a similar period now. We're in a transition period, potentially, in both countries politically, but this is exactly the time when people serious about the alliance should be building the agenda and serving up and getting ready something that a leader who wants to move forward can grab, or both leaders can grab. A couple of things that I think would be important. Again, to demonstrate the alliance has forward motion. We are in good shape in terms of bilateral relations overall. I just worked with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. They have a new survey coming out on what Americans think of the world. Trust in Japan is very high. Confidence in the alliance is very high. Americans say China is the most important partner, it's the most important country in Asia. But trust of China is about 30 points below trust in Japan. Trust in Japan is up at a level with Canada, Britain. In terms of bilateral relations, we're, I think, in many ways in good shape. There are problems, but I think we're in good shape. The question is, can we build an agenda to move forward? There are a couple of things I think would be important. Trade for Japan, and by the way, all of these are issues that make Japan stronger and make Japan more influential. And I think the bottom line for the US is, what makes Japan stronger and more influential is, by definition, in our interests. So trade, 36% of Korean trade is covered by FTAs, by trade agreements. The number for Japan is about 16%. So there have been various studies that show that if Japan did more FTAs and more trade liberalization, its economy would grow, its trade would grow, it would be more competitive. Now, TPP is Exhibit A. It's one of the most important and most WTO compliant trade liberalization agreements, and it's the one that's most political. But from an American perspective, I would say do them all. Do them with India, do them with everybody, do trade liberalization. TPP will give Japan leverage so that other trade partners take them seriously. And frankly, if Japan is doing trade agreements, real trade agreements, with other countries, Washington will take them more seriously. So, trade. Roles and missions. We face a very serious challenge in the first and second island chains, stretching down from Japan, where the PLA and other Chinese maritime services are very aggressively operating. We need a comprehensive US-Japan strategy for how we, as maritime nations, secure this domain. We've talked about cyber, we've talked about space, but I think the maritime domain is the most challenging right now because of the rapid expansion and ambitions of on the Chinese side. It's not that Beijing wants to challenge us, but if we leave an opening, a vacuum will be filled. It's not just about so-called air-sea battle or military instruments. There's a diplomatic aspect, there's an economic aspect. It should not be handled as a working level military issue. It needs to be a strategic, intensive discussion to do. Nuclear energy, I think people will talk about. Nuclear energy is important because it would, and by the way, Noda is on the right side of all these issues. But nuclear energy would demonstrate, A, that Japan is serious about growing the economy, and B, that Japan's serious about leading in the creation of international norms and institutions. 20, 30 years from now, the majority of nuclear power plants built in the world are going to be built by Russia, China, and other countries that are not going to have the same high standards for safety, transparency, non-proliferation that we, Japan, Korea have. If Japan gets out of the nuclear business, it is bad for Japan's economy, it's bad for international non-proliferation and safety in a world where nuclear power is moving forward. And finally, I think, in international relations theory, when a country faces a shifting balance of power, sometimes the country will do what is called internal balancing, increasing their own military power. Sometimes it will do what is called bandwagoning, just give up and shift to the rising power. The smart thing often to do is what's called external balancing, which is linking hands with other states to maintain a favorable balance of power. Japan's doing that with the US, Australia, Japan trilateral, with India, and with other countries, and it's a core part of Noda-san's strategy. There's one really very weak link in the strategy, and I don't even think I need to tell you, and it's Korea. And for an American, it is very hard to know how to manage this fight, food fight, between Japan and Korea right now. Except to say it is not in Japan's national interest, it is not in Korea's national interest to be distracting themselves from the common purpose they have with respect to North Korea, trade, and a stable Asia Pacific. I imagine for the State Department this is quite a headache right now. I know those of us from the think tank world are stuck in the middle of this. It is an area where I think the attraction of nationalism or populism, of using history issues to try to form a coalition, Hashimoto, Toru, and others, that Nagata-cho logic, that internal domestic logic, may be compelling, but the implications for Japan's strategic position have to really be thought about hard, because they're negative. And it's not just negative in terms of Japan's relations with Korea, it's negative in terms of how a new administration or a new Secretary of State is going to look at Japan. Is Japan serious about its national interest? Is Japan serious about increasing its power and influence? So it's a hard one, but an important one. Let me end with that. Thank you. I understand we'll have time for questions afterwards, and then you can ask me about Futenma. But for now, I'll end with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Yachi. It's always a great pleasure for me to be back in town and join the USJI events. I also thank Sasakawa and other people who are involved in this event. Thank you very much. My role for today perhaps is to walk you through where Japan stands now and what Japan is experiencing at the moment. But let me just start by saying that the remarks that I just heard from Mike reminded me of two kinds of movies. One, Michael Crichton's Rising Sun, that represented the era when Japan was dubbed an economic juggernaut a long time ago. And the new one that I saw on my way from Tokyo to Washington, D.C., that's a new movie called Battleship. That's, well, I'm not sure if you have seen this, but it's good for your children, not necessarily good for you, adults. But it's a movie about a fight between the alien invading force and the joint force between the United States and Japan. At one time, a Japanese naval captain called Nagata, casted by the Japanese famous movie actor, took a command of the entire force that alone was fighting hard against the alien force. You know, that represented the beauty of US-Japan security alliance. That was very much amusing. But so I wish I could say a resounding yes to the question that I self-imposed on myself, can Japan do it? But unfortunately, for many, many reasons that I'm going to explain from now on, at the moment at least, I don't think I can say yes to this question. Now, Japan, my main message is, as you have just heard from Mike, to make Japan stronger and more influential is to benefit all of us the Americans and the Japanese and probably Asians in the region as a whole. So my main concern is the weakening of Japan. And I'm not sure how we can turn this process around so that Japan could be, once again, more influential and stronger, both politically, militarily, and economically. So my main message for today is that Japan is really, really at a tipping point, and the country is not on the rise, but on the wane. 3 main bullet points. 1, Japan is no longer the country you think you have known for many years. All trend lines are going not north, but south. The resultant long-term uncertainties plus 311 PTSD, which I call that way, have left little room to see the evolution of their strategic environment and the rationale for furthering the US-Japan alliance. So I'm going to tell a little bit about national psyche on this. 3rd, domestic politics in confusion, yet to respond to a new normal, quote unquote, is soon to see more turbulence. As you have just heard from Ambassador Yachi, there are going to be many elections, not just 1, but 3 or 4. Whether any kind of core, durable leadership will emerge is very much an open-ended question. 1 minor point and what ought to be done. The 3 bullet points that I just laid out indicate that Japan is clearly at a real tipping point. I think this is one of the main core messages that Mike Green and others worked hard for the Armitage and Nye report version 3. As if to take advantage of Japan's weakening, Beijing, Seoul, and Moscow are all poking, to use the Facebook word, Tokyo in regard to territorial disputes. In the age of U.S. rebalancing toward the Indo-Pacific region, a weak Japan hinders alliance. What ought to be done now? Now, macro trend lines. Economic prowess. Let me show you a couple charts here. The left-hand side graph shows the trade balance, excluding services, with the United States. And on the right, you see current account balance with also the United States. And as you see, all trend lines are going downward. No longer Japan is enjoying the vast amount of trade surplus with the United States or current account balance with the United States. If you look at these graphs, then these 2 graphs represent Japan's cash-generating capacity, if you like, with the world as a whole. The left-hand side graph shows Japan trade account that has entered the red territory, as you see. And it is primarily because of the increased amount of energy import, mainly natural gas, from the rest of the world. It's, of course, due to the shutdown of the nuclear plants after 3/11. On the right-hand side, it is the current account balance. That's still in the surplus territory, but there is a growing chance that even the current account balance, including the capital transaction, not just goods transaction, but capital transaction, will soon head to the red territory. So Japan's no longer a cash generator as it was 10 years ago. So it represents the equation that if you have a trade account deficit, you have a negative savings rate. And this represents where Japan is in terms of the household savings rate. Japan's household savings rate is represented by the green line, Germany red, the United States purple. The United States household savings rate is much higher than that for Japan. It may contradict your conventional wisdom, but that's the fact of the matter. And then a familiar picture. Japan is an outlier here. More than 200% of government debt as opposed to GDP. The United States is bigger, than 100%, but Japan clearly represents the worst case among the OECD member nations, as you have heard many times, I suppose. And this affects how much amount Japan can spend for military purposes. Japan is flat, but China is growing up that way. And interestingly, India's expenditures for military purposes is going up. So I think it's going to be a matter of time, not whether or not that Japan's spending on military purposes is going to be outnumbered by India. Where the country is, national psyche story. 2012, long-term, lingering sense of malaise and directionlessness, if I can call it that way, sense of insecurity and uncertainty. Those under 35 have known no growth whatsoever. I see a couple faces in this category in this room, Japanese people who are under 35. I can tell you they have known no growth whatsoever since their birth. Gung-ho spirits, which was a hallmark at one time for Japanese corporations, I don't think can be seen that widely these days. Short-term, 311 PTSD. What does it mean? Tokyo, you see a resurgence of angered baby boomers. What does it mean? I'll touch on that later. Osaka, you see a prominent hero worship. There is a very much a famous mayor of Osaka City who probably contends to become leader of the nation and who is going to become a formidable force for the upcoming looming general election. As a whole, minimum tolerance for nuclear or something akin to it, even including Osprey, the new type of aircraft that the US Marine Corps is going to put into place soon. So there is a minimum tolerance on those things. So little room, at any rate, for envisaging big picture US continued patience in that regard. I think it's very much highly admirable. If I were an American, general in charge of US force in Japan, I would find it very much hard to understand why the Japanese are so much reluctant for Osprey to be deployed in Japan, because Osprey is for Japan's sake. Don't take them lightly. What does it mean? Baby boomers, now with much time to kill, because many of them have retired from the corporate Japan, have remembered the genes they developed in 1968. Kenzaburo Oe, the Nobel laureate in literature, and Ryuichi Sakamoto, a pop music composer, ganging up together to form a left-wing coalition. Their anti-nuclear power rallies have created a new reality. You know, the Prime Minister's official residence at the central part of Tokyo is weekly, surrounded by tens of hundreds of people who say, you cannot reactivate nuclear power plants. No to nuke, and so on and so forth. And they are representing a force to be reckoned with increasingly. The OE-led Article 9 Association, there is something like that, who is very much opposed to Japan revising its constitution, especially on the Article 9 peace clause, will likely merge with the anti-nuclear power groups. Resurgence of the 1960s styled anti-Americanism married with post-Fukushima little Japanism, which would say that Japan should not look outward but inward. You know, this insular sort of sentiment. They are married with the 1960s styled anti-Americanism. So big picture, strategic environment. You know, if you look at outside Japan, the situation is evolving very much rapidly, as you have heard from these two gentlemen. For the first time in history, I should say, Japan's strategic space is being challenged by its neighbors to a suffocating degree. Senkakus, to lose them is to lose the China Seas, east and south. Japan archipelago, entirely covered by Chinese strategic arsenal. Japan Sea, while the name itself, contested, I have to say, is to be congested by unfriendly naval vessels from China, Russia, and even from, sadly, Korea. President Putin is determined to create two aircraft carrier battle forces, and it's going to be very much likely that President Putin is going to deploy one of those in Vladivostok. The Pacific Island nations within the second island chain increasingly under the Beijing's influence, which is why Hillary Clinton, Secretary Clinton, and others are investing heavily into revitalizing U.S. relationships with those island nations. The same is being done from the Japanese side as well. So it is a national security crisis, I think, that is in the making. Still, U.S. rebalancing to counter all of the above has so far failed to provoke public discourse in Japan and gain support, I have to say. Now, a few words about territorial disputes, because many of you in the audience, I'm sure, are very much interested in this specific topic. To repeat, why the Senkakus matter. Not so much to do with right-wing nationalism as with freedom of navigation and securing Japan's strategic space. Nothing to do, once again, with economy, little to do with resources, but everything to do with geopolitics. China, with the Senkakus, if you could think about that, could control the waves in both East and South China Sea. So it's going to create a whole new security equation if the Senkakus were under the possession of the Chinese. Japan must stand tall equally also for the maritime ASEAN's sake. If Japan could not compete or prevent the Chinese provocation from escalating, what can other weaker nations such as the Philippines and the Vietnamese can do as opposed to the Chinese similar provocation in the South China Sea? So that's about Senkakus. What about the Northern Territory? I wish I could see you more using perhaps Google Earth, but if you look at that, Northern Territory stands very much neatly right in the middle of the navigation route now being developed between the East Asian nations, including China, including Korea, and including Japan, and the European nations, because the Arctic navigation route is being developed very much rapidly, and some of you in the audience may know that there has been an attempt from the Iceland side and the Chinese side to jointly develop the Arctic navigation route. So if at least one of those major islands in the Northern Territory was under the control of the Japanese, the US and Japan jointly could establish a watching post or hearing, listening post in one of those islands. And I'm sure in my lifetime, the Chinese Navy is going to invest heavily into that navigation route. So once again, Japan's archipelago is going to be surrounded by the increasing uncertainties from all directions, if you like, from the north, from the west, from the south. So that's about Northern Territory. Now, Japan's first ever democratic neighbor, who's that? South Korea. When President Lee Myung-hyun came into office, there was a great expectation among the Japanese. Finally, we have found someone that we could cooperate more firmly with or speak on a very much candid basis frequently with. But when Lee Myung-hyun had to step back abruptly 1 hour before the final forging of the GSOMIA, which is the agreement to share military intelligence between friendly partner nations like South Korea and Japan, something something strange was happening as the Japanese came to discover. And the provocation that had to be done by the president himself by making a landing on Takeshima came as a very much shocking awakening for the Japanese. So what's going on at the moment is there is a very much diminished expectation from the Japanese side about the South Korean leadership. But hope is not entirely lost because soon South Korea is going to have their presidential election and the new leader is going to be put into office. And I think many of the Japanese, of course diplomats, but politicians should be aware that there should be a chance once again to develop a functioning relationship and probably a cooperative relationship with the new leader-led South Korea. So that's the hope. But I should remind you that when someone called Yasuhiro Nakasone was in office as Prime Minister, he famously said to his counterparts from Germany and France that I envy you because you can have disputes all the time like that between you, but for me to have an argument with my democratic peer, I have to fly downward to Australia to find my peer. So that's East Asia. You know, compared to the 1980s when things were like that, Japan is blessed with a South Korean democracy. Finally, South Korea and Japan are on the same page in many, many respects. So long term, I think Japan has to expect a lot for the future South Korean leadership. Now, Yoshihiko Noda, in perspective, I'm sure many of you are also curious about who Yoshihiko Noda, the present Prime Minister, is like. I think he is a rare big picture conviction politician. Am I in the minority here? Perhaps, but let me just tell you the reason why. Because he's already quite a big achiever if you look at these points. Effectively ousted Ozawa and company. Junichiro Koizumi, the flamboyant famous prime minister, famously said that he was interested in destroying his own party, which he did not do at all. But Noda actually destroyed his party. Tax hike law passed, which normally takes a couple of cabinets. Ban on arms export loosened. Defense focus shifted to the Okinawa region. Even more big agendas he has, such as TPP, declaration as a maritime democracy, proposal to forge Pacific Charter a la Atlantic Charter. These are on the to-do list for Prime Minister Noda. Yet, he can rely on few. Because this is on the record, I cannot name the names of the individual, but you can just guess. Some are trustworthy, but weak in operation. Others are weak in practicalities and shifty in ideas. Still others are okay, but willing to take few risks in handling party affairs. You know, those are the so-called right-hand man surrounding Mr. Noda. So he's pretty much a lone figure. Roadblocks for alliance. I've got, this is a 220-page presentation, so it won't take long. Before closing. Osprey for Tenma, mutually reinforcing stalemate. Nothing more to be said. Failure, particularly to let the Okinawans know of the value of their geographic location. I think the Japanese leadership has to be more courageous in telling the truth to the Okinawans. Political capital too limited for Mr. Noda to reactivate collective defense. That's key to multiply network effect, even with Australia, Indonesia, etc. Though Noda is keen on doing that, as evidenced by Frontier Report. That said, let me just quote, it is vital that Japan possesses certain security capabilities as a means for self-defense. Japan should deepen security cooperation with the United States and other countries that share common values and aim to establish a network among them. Also, from the standpoint of enhancing security cooperation, it is essential to increase recognition of Japan as a valuable cooperation partner. Japan should strive to expand security cooperation channels by reviewing outdated institutions and practices, including the interpretation on the right of collective self-defense. So that's from the so-called Frontier report, which was handed to Prime Minister a couple months ago, and I was one of the members who came up with this proposal. And I can tell you for sure that Mr. Noda, as an individual, has been very much keen on this specific issue. He even says that this is the most important issue as a politician to achieve. And seen from Japan, I think the United States is doing everything possible. Take Ambassador John Roos. He's almost like Japan's self-appointed CCO, or Chief Cheerleading Officer. I subscribe his Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts, and everything he writes is about cheering up the Japanese, like mentioning the Tomodachi Alliance Partnership, or Tomodachi fundraising attempts, or Tomodachi scholarship, and so on and so forth. He is the cheerleading officer for Japan at the moment. Tomodachi-related PD attempts, as I just said, still in full throttle. US forces, particularly the Marines, have maintained, as has always been the case, most admirable patience. Expert after expert visiting Tokyo to tell of the evolving strategic equation. Is Japan up to the task? Well, this fall, party realignment is inevitable anyhow. This is my personal ideal scenario, but it holds like this. Noda, whether or not he is going to remain in office is increasingly an open-ended question, and many have started to doubt whether he can sustain. But on the LDP side, Abe is gathering force once again. Abe has recovered remarkably from his chronic illness by the new ways of curing that disease called clone disease. And he is, his health is better than any time in his life. And Abe seems to be getting closer, or otherwise, or, vice versa, to or from Hashimoto, the famous mayor in Osaka. And so that's the sort of coalition that I would like to see emerging from the general election. The point here is the DPJ and LDP are both effectively split into the strategic-minded, you should say conservatives, or the left-wing elements of both parties, Tanigaki, Hatuyama. And they will be left behind in this ideal scenario. But questions, whether Ozawa, can Abe make a comeback now, not later? For the question, the second question, I've already given you partially an answer, but whether Ozawa is an interesting question for you, perhaps, but many of you probably have heard of the megaton revelation made by the wife of Mr. Ozawa about his misconduct and about his timidity, especially after 3/11, to hide himself from the public, and so on and so forth. So it was a devastating blow for the credibility as a politician for Mr. Ozawa. So I don't think Mr. Ozawa can amass political capital as he was able to at one time in his political career. Some policy suggestions were closing. Can there be a solution that enhances both the economic power of Japan and the alliance? I think that's the crux of the matter. I think Japan needs to be stronger, both economically and as a result, politically and militarily. For instance, this is pretty much an out-of-the-box proposal. Alaska-Hokkaido undersea gas pipeline. Is this ever unthinkable? is this ever unfeasible? You should think about it. I know the United States is undergoing a tremendous energy revolution, shale gas revolution. I think as the graphs indicated, sooner rather than later, within the next 10 years or so, Japan is going to run not trade surplus, but trade deficit with the United States, mainly due to the increased amount of natural gas imported from the United States to Japan. I know there are political barriers for them to happen, but what about creating the pipeline connection between the Alaskan part of the United States and Japan, so that energy-wise, both nations are physically going to be tied more firmly. Toyota and Honda should have another success story by developing natural gas cars. At the end of the day, my generation of the Japanese was very much encouraged by the effort done those days by Honda and Toyota to have better cars and sell them in the United States and be accepted by an increasing number of American consumers. That kind of success story is not history, it's passé. But for Japan to rejuvenate, if you like, itself, it needs this kind of success story. And they can do it if they shift their focus from the current line of hybrid cars to natural gas cars, which takes very little technological effort for them to do. I think Toyota and Honda can sell those gas-powered cars, not gasoline, but gas-powered cars. All to benefit from a resurgent shale gas-powered America. Japan deserves to be the first beneficiary. Noda's Churchillian idea to forge the Pacific Charter with the United States is an idea worthy of consideration. Anything to develop our joint maritime identity is welcome. So the joint cooperation with the United States, between the United States and Japan, to help revive the economies of the South Pacific Island nations is one indication that both nations are heading towards the right direction. Now, appendix, Japan's to-do list, reactivate the right for collective self-defense, all these familiar issues, but let me just read them out. Pronounce to enter TPP and do so ASAP. Spend more on JSDFs and the Coast Guard. Develop anti-A2AD measures by making bases like Kadena more resilient and by deploying Seabuster missiles in the area. Strengthen Aussie-Japan-US cooperation on island nations. Involve the UK and France as resident Pacific partners. We should remember, France is still a resident Pacific partner, and they're very much proud of it. And the UK is rediscovering the 5-power arrangement. That's the spillover of the empire system of the UK, but the UK, in that sense, still holds a footprint, albeit small, in the Pacific. Involve the UK, so makes a lot of sense. Sell boats, etc. to ASEAN partners, build their human capacities. That's been made possible by the loosening of the ban on arms export by the Prime Minister Noda. So Japan can sell boats to the Philippines and to the Indonesians. Regularize the bilateral naval exercises with India. But there's a great degree of hesitation on the Indian side, as you have seen an agreement with between China and India to have bilateral exercises. But at any rate, Japan can seek this direction as well. Number 9, seek more bilateral visits overseas by PM and other top ministers. Easy to be said, but still hard to be done. Number 10, learn from Korean experiences to build ASAM-like institutes and to rebuild JEI-like PD unit in DC. So this is about soft diplomacy, soft power diplomacy, which a lot of you in Washington, DC have been eager to see happening. Lately, I have come to see what tremendous, effort ASEAN Institute in South Korea is doing to increase its profile in the English-speaking community. But I have to say there is no think tank community in Japan close to what ASEAN is doing now. And JEI, of course, was the harbinger for KEI, but not many people in DC remember, I think, that JEI was here doing a commendable job 10 years ago. And I think JEI, like PD unit, should be revitalized in DC again. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Taniguchi. We had very excellent presentations, very interesting, very insightful, and also stimulating. Let me say my plan of facilitating the discussion in today's session, morning session. I will reserve the 20 minutes in the last for the discussion with questions and answers with the floor. And we are going to close at 10 minutes after 12. Is that okay? Okay. So, because we started late. And before that, the questions and answers, maybe I should ask some clarification, or maybe some panelists have additional comments. To do so, let me ask, first of all, questions to Dr. Green and Mr. Zumwalt. So my question is quite direct and concrete. Japan is now facing the pretty serious problems with our neighboring countries, particularly China and North Korea and South Korea and Russia. And with China, the panelists mentioned the problems, but particularly senkaku or maritime policy or naval strategy of China, and particularly senkaku is a very delicate issue. And also with North Korea, abduction and nuclear program, and with South Korea, Dokdo or Takeshima program, and comfort women program, and other historical or history programs, and needless to say, the Northern Territory program with Russia. And how do the American people see those situations which Japan is facing now? And if you don't mind, maybe I'll ask Dr. Green first, and then Mr. Zumwalt will follow up. And I know Mr. Zumwalt is a contemporary government member, so naturally he has some reservation in making a very frank view, and the camera is here and so on. So maybe I should ask Dr. Green first. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
I spent most of the summer working on a study for the Pentagon that was required by legislation on U.S. forward strategy, posture strategy in the Asia Pacific, and we interviewed, my colleagues and I, hundreds of people, and traveled around the region. And, you know, it was not a mathematical survey, but I think we had a pretty good sense of what senior officials, military experts, and others thought. I would say, from a U.S. perspective, to try to give a direct answer, the Russian military buildup in the Far East is not seen as a very big deal. Russia is a declining power with a troublesome leader right now, who is doing things for reasons of national identity and domestic politics. It's not that it should be ignored or that it's trivial, but I think that in the long run, Russian influence in the Far East is not going to be that great. And there are lots of things to work on between Japan and Russia, particularly energy, that should over time build a better relationship. So it's not, in my view, worth overreacting. Take note of it, monitor it, surveil, but not worth overreacting. I mentioned Korea earlier. The disputes over Takeshima or Tokuto are very unlikely to lead to conflict. They are mostly, they're deep-rooted. My Korean friends always remind me of this. It's deep-rooted, there's a long history and so forth, but it is not a contest of geostrategic will. There's ample room for moving out of this current cycle and into a cycle of cooperation. The North Korean case is acute and serious, I think. But what do American people think about it? I think views are somewhat divided. Can we just wait and contain them? Some people think that. Or does their growing plutonium and probably uranium stockpile representing a real serious threat? I think it's a serious threat, but the views are somewhat divided. Views are also divided in the US on the Senkaku issue. I think a lot of Americans, including in the government, see this as an issue of nationalism, national identity, maybe economics. Personally, I agree with Taniguchi-san. I think it is a geostrategic issue. I think that I know that Beijing has a strategy to move forward what the Central Military Commission calls the Near Sea Doctrine. This is what rising powers do. They want to control the near seas. It's what we did with the Monroe Doctrine. The problem is that the near sea, meaning the first island chain and probably the second island chain, includes Japan, the Philippines, 2 US treaty allies, Taiwan, something like 80% of shipping traffic in the Pacific. And it's historic American view that the maritime domain in the Pacific is of vital interest. So we have to be smart about this. I don't think that Beijing wants confrontation with the US over this. I think that the best way to shape Chinese thinking about this is close coordination and close cooperation and alignment among maritime states, not fighting and fraction and division over other territorial issues. And then a kind of calm, steady stance. And China, I think, to conclude, sorry, but you asked me, it was actually rather a complicated question. I think Beijing basically has 3 views. First, that China's rise should be peaceful and should not be threatening, and historically that's always been the case. I think that's the consensus in the elite. Second, that China should implement a counter-containment strategy, that China's foreign policy strategy should prevent containment or alignment against China, especially maritime, but overall. And third, that in particular in the PLA, China should develop an anti-intervention strategy or counter-intervention strategy, meaning that China can raise the costs so that the US or other maritime powers could not intervene in a crisis in the East China Sea, Taiwan, South China Sea, or the Korean Peninsula without considerable risk to us, to be able to deter and dissuade us by having a more dominant position in the first island chain. The problem with China's strategy is that last one, pursuing counter-intervention, undercuts the first two, because it encourages countries to cooperate more and in effect creates containment. As Joe and I said, the only country that can contain China is China. So our response ought to be, we ought to be cognizant of that, and we ought to think about how to shape Chinese decision making, because at the end of the day, I don't think Beijing's core national strategy is to be revisionist or change the overall structure of politics in Asia in a way that's confrontational and dangerous.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to Mike's excellent presentation is I think it's very important in considering these issues to focus on Japan's core interests and key interests, which is peace and stability in the region and economic prosperity. And I think those are interests that the United States shares, and we want to work very closely with Japan to deal with a whole range of challenges in the region.
Teresa, would you like to? Then about US-Japan relationship, I think all of the panelists say that US-Japan relationship itself as a bilateral relationship are pretty in a good shape. Particularly in my observation, the March 11 earthquake disaster, the American people, US government, particularly American forces in Japan have been so helpful. So compassionate, sympathetic to the Japanese. We Japanese are really been appreciated that. But on the other hand, we have some problems. One is the phthema, and other is osprey. And also, in the long run, because of the China or other countries, US-Japan alliance must be strengthened and should have a more broader geopolitical implication or context, including international peace cooperation and the worldwide. So I think it's good to discuss about the future of US-Japan alliance. Let me say my personal view on our bilateral alliance system. The present US-Japan security treaty has been concluded as a kind of a revision of the old one in 1960, and at the time of PC administration. This Article 5 and Article 9 of this present security treaty is a pretty well organized system of security relationship between us. But I would say that there is one very delicate, difficult point in this security system. That is a kind of a sense of unfairness. US side has the obligation to defend Japan. That means they would dedicate the lives of that and so on of the young American soldiers for the defense of Japan. But that is not vice versa. And Japan is also, on the other hand, providing the bases, facilities, and also bear some parts of the budget of the American forces stationed in Japan. And at the time, there is some conflict like trade friction and so on. Both sides have some sense of unfairness. And to solve this problem, I personally believe that the more reciprocity must be introduced. Maybe eventually the type of self-defense or reciprocal defense treaty between the two countries. But this is a kind of a mid-term or long-term policy. And as a present problems, osprey and phthema, particularly phthema is pretty difficult, but the problem must be solved shortly. Again, this is a very delicate problem, but maybe I'll ask Mr. Zumwalt to tell us what the State Department is considering.
Regarding
phthema and osprey.
I'm happy to say something, but actually, Mike spent a whole summer dealing with this issue. Did you want to say something first, and I'll
You'll owe me. Phthema and osprey. You can get our report. It's on the CSIS website. We did a very detailed assessment using several dozen criteria to examine options for U.S. bases and force postures in the Pacific. These included things like operational factors, budget, feasibility, impact on quality of life, impact on the environment. We had a quite exhaustive template we used to look at options. And we looked at the alternatives to phthema, and you can see it on the website. We sort of gave a check or check minus depending on whether it had operational or strategic or quality of life or political merit or demerit. And when we did this with a group of outside advisors and went through it, we concluded that phthema was, not surprisingly, hard. It had several obstacles. But it was less hard than all the other options everyone talks about. And we looked at, in some detail, integration in Kadena. We looked at offshore islands like Iejijima or Shimojijima. We looked at using Naha. These are all ideas that are out there. And there are operational complications with all of them, there are political complications, there are budget issues, but at the end of the day, none of them were easier or more operationally or strategically or politically attractive than the current option for Henoko, as hard as that is. So we concluded, if the US and Japanese governments decide, you know what, we're giving up on the Henoko option and we're going to move, it would be a real disaster. Why? Because we knew from interviewing dozens and dozens of people at the local level in Okinawa and elsewhere, that as soon as you switch to quote-unquote Plan B, whether it was Kadena integration or whatever, you would immediately face strong opposition and be checkmated. The governments couldn't move forward at all. And in the process, we the US and Japan, would lose enormous credibility by saying, we give up, we'll try something else, and immediately having that fail, which would hurt efforts to realign forces and reduce the burden on Okinawans. It would hurt the credibility of the alliance at a time of increasing challenges in the region. It would hurt the credibility of the political leaders domestically. So, so we just couldn't say in good faith that there's a Plan B that works and that there's a better option than the one we're on. We tried. We really wanted to humiliate Jim Zomal. And we gave it every effort we could. And we had a lot of, frankly, we had a lot of interest from members of Congress to try to find that silver bullet. But we also concluded that, you know, from our perspective outside of government, it would not be a bad idea to look at these other options. In part because part of the challenge, the so-called A2AD, anti-access area denial challenge, is that all bases are under missile threat now, serious missile threat. And one of the things you do is have more bases and more options and more opportunity to disperse forces or have redundancy. So for those reasons, it makes a lot of sense to start looking at dual use of facilities, self-defense force developing facilities for their own purposes, and so that you have an option down the road. If the Futema thing really hits a wall, I don't think it has yet, but if it really hits a wall, or if for military reasons or operational reasons you want other options. But for the foreseeable future, we concluded, unfortunately, Jim Zomal is still going to have to keep working on this option.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think Mike did a really good service to us in his earlier remarks where he sort of went back to the 1980s and talked about when he first became involved inside the government working on US-Japan relations. And the reason I said that's so important is it's a good reminder for us that this alliance that has endured for now 60 years has faced a lot of challenges in the past, and we have overcome those challenges. So just because we're facing a challenge today doesn't mean that it's a crisis. And I think back to 1960 when President Eisenhower had to cancel his visit to Japan because of the state of relations and the massive demonstrations that were occurring in Japan. Or I think back to the 1970s with Okinawa reversion, which was a very, very tough issue. And we, both governments managed to work through that tough issue and come up with a new approach that has worked for quite a long time. So I think it's important for us to remember that, yes, we have a challenge, as Mike pointed out, but we have had challenges before, we've overcome those challenges before, so that's important for us to remember. So I guess the only thing I would add on the Futema capability and the Osprey is we think these are capabilities that are needed for us to meet our commitments to Japan, to defend Japan, but we want to work very closely with our Japanese friends and partners to reduce the impact of our presence because of that will make the alliance more enduring.
I'm sorry, I need to add one thing, I apologize. But of course, underlying this whole question is, do we need the Marine Corps? Which is another issue we looked at very hard and spent a lot of time on. And the throwaway line you'll hear is, well, the Marines aren't going to fight the PLA. You know, they would if you ask them. but it's pretty much a mismatch. So why do we have to have Marines there? Well, the Marines aren't going to invade North Korea with 1 million troops. So why do we need Marine Corps out there? I think, briefly, the answer is we need them. First of all, the part of the purpose of a forward military presence is to build partnerships. The self-defense forces, the Australian military, the New Zealand military, the Korean military, the Canadian military are all in the Pacific moving in the direction of creating amphibious forces like the Marine Corps. They all want to train with the Marine Corps. They all want to do things with the Marine Corps. So in terms of engaging partners and allies, they're one of the most important forces we have out there. Second, war doesn't just start because two big guys in the block go at each other. War starts because there is instability around the periphery, collapsing and failing states, natural disasters, terrorism. All these things create a vacuum and disorder that brings big powers to fight. That's how World War I started, that's how the Pacific War started. How do you deal, what instruments do you have to deal with these crises or instability? Well, you can send the self-defense forces with enough time and with the right legislation. The Koreans can send a bit of stuff off the peninsula, our allies and friends, Canada and Australia can, but there's no force that can move with the numbers and the speed and the sustainability to deal with all these crises as the Marine Corps and prevent a larger disintegration of order, which in turn creates greater chances of danger. And in Korea right now, because of North Korea's WMD and because of the dangers of instability, the importance of an amphibious option for dealing with the range of scenarios we now face is much more important. So for a whole host of reasons, we need a forward presence in the Marine Corps in the Pacific. I think Japan needs it, the US needs it. I'm sorry to take the time, I think that's important. Otherwise, yeah, why would we bother with Futema? I think the Marine Corps, and they have not, God bless them, and my dad was a Marine and my grandfather was a Marine, they've not done a good job making their case, frankly, in Washington. But I think if you think it through strategically, they have a very strong case for being forward deployed. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Well, I've just heard a very much powerful presentation about the need of Japan to have U.S. Marine Corps deployed in Japan. But the unfortunate fact as well is the Japanese government has been very much incapable of making case of how important it is for Japan to have U.S. Marine Corps. USMC, for many in Japan, still is a source of nuisance, source of noise, source of danger. It's a tremendous humiliation, I think, to the Americans who are very much proud of their sons and daughters joining Marine Corps. And I think much effort has to be done on the Japanese side as well.
Thank you. Now, I think we will take some questions from the floor. And please say your name and your affiliation, if you possible. The mic is over there, so please, yes.
I'm Gil Rosman from Princeton University, and I have a question for Mr. Taniguchi. In your agenda for what should be done, you assume that progress with Russia is not possible, but you mentioned the desirability of having one or more islands as a listening post. Does that mean you think that a mistake was made in 2001 by abandoning the Irkutsk process? The second part of this question is the biggest difference I think that has emerged in this discussion is about Korea. How to deal with Korea? Do you think a coalition of Noda, Abe, and Hashimoto would be useful for improving relations with South Korea, or would that damage Japan's prospects for strategic cooperation in this vital area, which I think you underestimated in your comments?
Thank you.
Mr. Taniguchi, could you answer the question after finishing the 2000? Is that all right? Because I don't want to keep Sunday. So please ask your question.
Good morning. I'm Jacob Vodder, a student at Georgetown University. And my question, I think, is probably best directed toward Professor Taniguchi or Ambassador Yachi, but please anyone can chime in. I'm just wondering what you feel the prospects are for Hashimoto and his new party that looks like it's going to be forming in the national scene, and the manifesto that they are going to put forward, which has a lot in there, but I think some potential for shaking up the Japanese political system and relations going forward. Things like direct election and potentially a referendum on Article 9. So just what you think the potential for future U.S.-Japan relations might look like given this new development. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Steve Winters, local researcher. I guess I'd direct this to Taniguchi-sensei. I've been talking to quite a number of Chinese university students from the mainland, and I'm utterly amazed by the anti-Japanese sentiments of these students. And of course, just recently, a week or two ago, there were demonstrations in over 25 or 30 Chinese cities, which were noted for the youth presence. And now we see something similar with the Korean youth. Of course, there was an Olympic bronze medalist and so forth and so on. So then we're talking about the coming generation, the future generation here in both those countries. And I don't think it's a populism manipulated by the governments. I think it's actually a groundswell. Whereas on the other hand, in Japan, you see a lot of indifference on the part of Japanese youth that I speak with. Whereas from the older generation in Japan, you see people like this Gambare Nippon and the statement by the former air defense minister, which can't possibly do anything but exacerbate these problems. So how do you address this whole question, which is leading to a disaster?
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Taniguchi.
Well, for the first question asked by one of the foremost experts on Russo-Japan relationship, I feel very much reluctant to answer that question because I know he knows much better than I do. But it's nearly impossible, realistically thinking, for Japan to get back all the islands in total from Russia to Japan. There must have been a couple of opportune times in the past for Japan to do that. I can think of the time period, a short space of time, a window of opportunity opened after the demise of Soviet Russia. But I don't think it's going to be possible for Japan to do that. But for a negotiation purpose, I think it's all the more natural for Japan to maintain the old position that it needs to get back all the islands in total as a whole from Russia. But Japan with just one or two islands is much better than Japan with no island whatsoever. And the main point for this is, it is not for nationalists' sake. It is for maintaining freedom of navigation. It is to secure freedom passage of commercial vessels. And it is to say, it is to declare that it is always the obligation for the democratic navigation, democratic maritime nations like the United States and Japan to maintain that order. And I think that should be a new strategy that should be employed more by the incoming political leaders in Japan. So I would like to see very much that one or two of those islands are going to be used jointly by the United States forces and the Japanese maritime self-defense forces. And the second part of your question, Professor's question, whether Hashimoto-Abe Noda coalition will successfully deal with South Korea. Let me just address that question with the second question about the prospect whether Hashimoto can gain enough support. You know, for me, Hashimoto is a big question mark, period, full stop. He says one thing, but he says quite another. But when it comes to foreign policy, it seems to me that he is on the right page. Like he encourages Japan to have a TPP agreement sooner rather than later. And like he mentions how important it is for Japan to maintain the good relationship with the United States, the alliance partner. So he seems to be on the right end of the spectrum, on the correct end of the spectrum in terms of the alliance management, in terms of the importance of openness that should be maintained. So that much is the reason why I think it's going to be better for Japan to have Hashimoto within the leadership community. But I can't go no farther than that because Hashimoto, as I said, is representing one of the new generations of the Japanese politicians who are very much well versed in Twitter. But three-line message that he continuously sends almost without interruption each and every passing day is very little in substance, very much in, very well representing that he is a populist. He's well at seeing the tea leaves of the Japanese mind. But let me just stop there. I don't think I can tell you more about who Hashimoto is. But once again, let me just repeat: Hashimoto seems to be on the correct end of the spectrum, at least about foreign policy and the security policy. Now, what can Japan do to ameliorate the bad feelings among the Chinese and the Koreans? It may be true that they have been naturally grown sentiment, not simply manipulated sort of sentiment by the central government, especially in the case of China. It may be true, but it is equally amazing for me to see that in Korea, Japan has been still viewed as a rising security threat for the South Koreans. That's the line that South Korean media are fond of adopting, even now, to depict Japan. There is a huge gap in terms of self-perception on both ends. The Japanese no longer regard themselves as a contender of dominance in any respect in China. Budget declining, population declining. Clearly, Japan is a declining power. The only thing is the Japanese are not yet prepared to accept that reality. And I would like to see Japan revising itself more. But for Korea, for the South Koreans, the Japanese are a growing military threat. When the Hong Kong activists landed on the Senkaku Island a month ago, their political slogan, was to prevent Japanese militarism from gaining power in Asia. Where is Japan's militarism? I would like to see some of that. So that kind of huge difference, I frankly don't know how to fill the gap. In this age of dense traffic between and among these 2-3 nations, it is all the more amazing. If you look at Ginza shopping district, it's like a Fifth Avenue in New York is being filled by Chinese tourists. No department store cannot have a strategy without catering to the Chinese students. No college, no university, including mine and Ambassador Yachi's, cannot sustain their financial budgets without having more and more Chinese students. Among the 10, 12 small schools that I have, 7 of them are Chinese. Given this reality, it's unbelievable that the Chinese and Koreans are still viewing Japan that way. And frankly, I have no public diplomacy policy to change this.
Is there any other question?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Actually, sorry. My name is Yoshihiko, and I'm an attorney, and I'm not just a specialist in international politics. However, I am interested in what's happening to the U.S.-Japan relations, and it appears to me that I think the alliance will be strengthened if Japan takes a more active role in abating the tension in the Pacific, instead of just relying on the alliance for every little issue. Having said this, I do know that Japan has a lot of piled up problems which take an enormous amount of political will to resolve or abate. One of them, I think we've been discussing the strained China-Japan relations. Japanese, I think, vast majority of the Japanese people don't understand why the Chinese are so angry about the Japanese and take such hostile actions decades after the war was over. I think the Japanese politicians, and in fact the Japanese people themselves, probably should look into their heart and really find out why the Chinese still consider Japan as a militarist nation and still are so hostile to us. I think one of the answers may lie in the fact that Japan hasn't properly accounted for the Nanjing massacre. That was a big issue about 20 years ago. And there was a book published, I think, by a Chinese-American person living in Chicago. She claimed that the Japanese military killed 1 million residents in Nanjing. But Japanese neither rebutted that argument with concrete statistics. Japan could have, at that time, probably hired, as a third country to essentially find and probably set up a certain amount of funds and compensate those individuals or the families or the descendants who were victims of the Japanese military act at the time. And I think that we wouldn't be facing, in my personal opinion, the powder problems that we do with China. I think the problem with Korea seems to be a lot easier. Again, Japan has to deal with the forced prostitution issue heads on, instead of sort of throwing it to the judicial branch, which has been very ineptly dealing with the issue. Now, they are not even facing these issues, and I think the Korean, the survivors and the families of victims seem to have sort of given up hope of getting a judicial relief in Japan. These are some of the issues that Japan has to really very, very seriously consider and face. Without Japan resolving these issues with its neighbors, but just simply relying on sort of the overall U.S.-Japan relations, which are already very, very good and which are extremely important, I think we're preventing the alliance to become stronger, an opportunity to become stronger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like somebody to respond?
If there's time for one question, I would
Okay.
ask.
Yes.
Hi, I'm John Bradford. I'm a visiting fellow at National Defense University. Professor Taniguchi, you said twice that if Japan were to lose control of the Senkakus, it would mean losing control of the East China Sea and the South China Sea. I'd like you to expand on that if possible, and I have two specific questions. One, what is the scenario where control could be lost? And two, the second question, can you explain the ramifications for the South China Sea, given the geographic separation? Thanks.
All right, for the first gentleman who suggested that there has to be a massive improvement between Japan and China and Japan and Korea, and especially about Nanjing massacre, I think I can tell you a couple of things. You seem to be suggesting there has to be a third-party involvement, like in the case of Turkey-Armenia dispute or Northern Ireland dispute, both of which U.S. senators have been involved heavily in improving the situation. Well, I think in the future that's going to be one possibility, but I frankly don't think the Chinese will accept this. Because we have to think about the history that it is the Chinese that have almost brainwashed the entire population about one single line of this issue, and I don't think they can still accept the possibility, the sheer possibility that there may be another story to be told by the other party. For that purpose, the Japanese, I think the government and the Chinese government started about 10 years ago, about 7, 8 years ago, to seek a possibility whether or not both parties can agree on joint writing of textbooks. And I think many of the friends that Mike has and Jim has, from both sides, from the Chinese side and from the Japanese side, and from the Korean side, from the Japanese side, spent a lot of time to scrutinize what sort of things should be written for the future generations of the countries involved. Once again, when it comes to critical and sensitive issues, especially after the Second World War, the Chinese could not say anything bold because there was so strict a code imposed by the central authority of the Chinese Communist Party about what to say and what not to say. So there was no academic consultation, for that matter, between the two scholastic communities from China and Japan. That's the fact of the matter. Now, to the question about why senkakus matter for the South China Sea, I think it's obvious that Japan is the biggest player in this game of international law, and Japan is on the end that pushes that international law should be the norm to dictate the order of the region, together with the Australians, of course the Americans, and sometimes the British as well. But it is exactly the prevailing international law that the Chinese seem to be very much hesitant to subscribe to. If Japan falls in this respect, no wonder the weaker nations like the Philippines, the Vietnamese, and Brunei, and so on, will have to fall under even more strong influence of the Chinese. So when disputes occur in South China Sea, it is, I think, public knowledge that diplomats from Vietnam and Indonesia came to Washington, D.C., as well as to Japan, to push both governments to stand firm against China. And indeed, when Cambodia failed to produce any written document statement after the ASEAN ministerial meetings this year, once again, the Indonesian government wanted Japan to get involved in maintaining the firm stance that international law should be the norm that the Chinese should subscribe to. So that's about international law. Senkaku issue is about the international law, I think. The scenario about how the senkakus could fall under the control of the Chinese. Well, each passing day has seen both Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force assets and the assets from the Japanese Coast Guard patrolling very closely around the senkakus. And I should add, their practice has been supported almost daily by an equally important involvement of the U.S. Navy. So one can say safely that senkakus are under effective control by the Japanese government. So the scenario as to how the Chinese can put these islands under their control, I mean, a sudden deployment of hundreds of fishing boats, that's very likely. And they could have to have a collision with the Japanese Maritime Defense Force or Coast Guard. And then those sorts of provocations can be done on a regular basis if the will exists on the Chinese side. Exactly for these things not to happen, I think the Japanese Self-Defense Force and Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy are working hard. But I think the penetration using civilian force, fishing boats and so on, will be one possibility. And if I could risk going further into details, it is not the island that matters. It is really islets or stones that constitute the Senkaku archipelago that matter. The Chinese can take over those small stones and then claim that this should be the boundary for their maritime domain. This could happen. And if that happens, that will change the, that will allow the Chinese to claim that not just Senkakus, but Okinawan archipelago. If you look at the map closely, Okinawan archipelago are under their ownership. I'm giving you a roundabout answer to your question, but there are many scenarios to be thought hard. But using the civilians like fishermen, or taking over small stones, those could constitute a very much dangerous scenario to be seriously thought about.
Thank you very much. Is there any additional comment?
Just briefly, I have to say I don't think Taniguchi-san's scenario is that far-fetched, especially if you look at what's happening in the South China Sea around Scarborough Shoal and so forth. The weak link in the island chain is down on the Philippines right now. I think that's a more likely scene of coercion. But I think it's one continuous strategic line that is where the interaction is interrelated. I think Mr. Saito raised a very, very important question, or point. The theme is responsibility to share U.S. and Japanese responses. I think for U.S. interests, well, let me put it this way. For Japan, it is really very important that the U.S. manage China carefully, that the U.S. manage the North Korean nuclear issue carefully, that the U.S. have the right mix of deterrence, but also negotiations, dissuasion, but also reassurance. That is no less true for the U.S. in terms of how Japan deals with its neighbors. A Japan that's close to the U.S. is not good enough. I think for a strong alliance, Japan has to be astute and skillful at managing its strategy towards other countries. It's easier to say when you're out of government, but I think it very much affects things. And briefly on the history issue, I do this with some hesitation, but I think this is going to be a harder problem for a little while. I think we're going into a cycle for a variety of reasons why this will be a harder problem between Japan and Korea and Japan and China. I'm not convinced that when Lee Myung-bak is replaced by Park Geun-hye or Moon Jae-in or someone else, Ahn Cheol-soo or somebody, that it's necessarily, that it's going to suddenly get easier because of the Supreme Court decision in Korea and other factors. There is a certain cycle of these though, and I think eventually it will climb out. Litigation makes it worse. Litigating exactly what happened by governments or politicians, litigating exactly what happened with government or exactly what happened with Nanjing only makes it worse. That way is not, historians like Dachin Young and others have tried as academics, but for government or politicians, it only makes it worse. That's something to keep in mind. I think when Taniguchi-san said he doesn't have any public diplomacy tools left, I think there are a few. It's hard, but there are maybe a few. And one of the very important ones will be the personal chemistry between the leader of Japan and the next leader of Korea, and perhaps between Xi Jinping and the leader of Japan. And through their chemistry and through the signals they send together, they can have a very important influence on the tone. And right now politics domestically are so volatile in all three, Japan, Korea, and China, and that's hard. But that, I think, is one critical toolkit. It's how the leaders demonstrate to their people their relationship, their willingness to work together, how they discuss these kinds of issues. It's in the Kante, it's in the Chongwade, it's in the leadership levels where the best public diplomacy tool may lie. I'm not talking about formal apologies or statements or joint statements, but just the tone and tenor that the leaders set is critical.
Thank you. No? Okay. Now we have come to the end of today's session, and I'm very happy about today's session because we got such a wonderful panelist and audience. And before I came here, I was told that in Washington, D.C., Japan is being passed. And Japan's status is not as high as before. But I will tell you that Mr. Taniguchi and myself will do our best after we go back to Japan. Japan will be coming back instead of being passed. Thank you very much.